Every election loss or underperformance in this country will tear a political party apart. This is virtually a law in politics, whether in America or abroad. Sometimes the ensuing divide is minimal and will not impact the ensuing election cycle. Other times the divide can be so large that infighting will inevitably cripple the party's chances in the future due to a lack of party unity. Even though they won the popular vote by 3 points and retook the House gavel away from Nancy Pelosi, the 2022 election was a train wreck for Republicans. Failing to retake the Senate with a favorable map, losing a net seat even, coupled with missing out on many key governorships when the current president suffering with an approval rating in the low 40s, was an unmitigated disaster compared to most people's expectations. This may very well be the last autopsy report video that I do on these midterms, as I already have done many, but this is arguably the most important one of all. There is a lot of blame to go around, and nobody is really 100% innocent here, but it's insane how much of the blame is misplaced. If this continues, the party will continue to learn absolutely nothing from its past weak performances, and they will keep losing power in ensuing election cycles. Establishment Republicans need and have found a scapegoat for their losses to deflect blame. Many of them are blaming Donald Trump for their midterm losses, claiming that he propped up low-quality candidates that caused the GOP to underperform in key races across the country. They choose to blame him instead of blaming the antics of the GOP establishment, their 1980s-style messaging in 2023, and the mechanics about how the GOP is navigating our monstrosity of an election system. I'm sick of the establishment blaming the man who saved them from becoming a regional party for their problems instead of themselves, and I'm also sure that many of you are sick of the "Blumph lost us 2018, 2020, and 2022" tagline as well. It's very misleading. Paul Ryan and the House's willingness to fumble the ball on key issues like healthcare and John McCain's stubbornness and unwillingness to give Trump a policy victory made the 2018 midterm losses bigger than they had to be. Still, we saw Republicans flip 4 Senate seats from blue to red that year. 2020 was lost for a variety of different reasons, and Trump probably could have found a way to win had he done everything correctly. But for him to come within 43,000 votes across 3 states of a second term in a year with a global pandemic, a large economic downturn, rising crime, and massive chaos in the streets was impressive nonetheless, especially given the fact that Republicans netted many seats in the House when many people had them losing. So, that brings us to 2022. Did Donald Trump of all people actually cost Republicans the midterms? Without further ado, let's dive into this by being as objective as possible and seeing who is really to blame here. Let's take a look at the individual swing races Republicans lost. We'll start off here by talking about the key Senate races, then we will move on to the gubernatorial races. So the closest Senate race in 2022 was that in the state of Nevada, where Adam Laxalt fell short by less than 10,000 votes. Laxalt was likely the best candidate in the running regardless on the Republican side, and there really should be no regrets here. He easily won the primary, and likely would have done so without a Trump endorsement. This was a mechanics issue above all else. If he was able to get Trump's rural percentages that Trump got in 2020 across several counties, he would be in the Senate right now, proving that Republicans need to ballot harvest wherever Democrats are doing it to maximize turnout. He also was vastly outspent by the incumbent Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, while Mitch McConnell diverted plenty of funds for this race into states like Ohio, which was going to be solidly Republican regardless. Laxalt was the right choice for Nevada, and he may also be the best bet for knocking off Jackie Rosen in 2024 as well. He deserved much better. Verdict: not Trump's fault. Let's go one state to the southwest to the state of Arizona, where Blake Masters shockingly underperformed compared to expectations, losing to Mark Kelly by nearly 5 points, and even underperforming controversial Secretary of State candidate Mark Fincham in the process. The truth is that Masters would have won the primary regardless. He was already gaining steam before Trump endorsed him, putting him over the top. However, he should not have pivoted to the libertarian side of things in the general election. which really didn't maximize his appeal, and he should not have mentioned cutting Social Security or Medicaid in a state with many retirees. Pivoting in the general election didn't seem to help him, and his original messaging regarding raising families on one income again likely would have taken him much further. Also, being outspent 6-1 did not help him out either. His primary competitor, Mark Brnovich, who many of the establishmentarian figures were propping up, likely would have lost this election as well, even if he was better funded, given his general nature to underperform and his laziness which shined through during the campaign trail. And Jim Layman, who wasn't liked by many wings of the GOP or independents, would likely have performed the worst of all. Verdict: not Trump's fault. Let's move on to the Keystone State of Pennsylvania, where celebrity Dr. Mehmet Oz surprisingly lost by 5 points to incoherent vegetable John Fetterman.
And the Eagles are so much better than the Eagles.
The bench as a whole on the Republican side in this primary was very weak. Trump's initial endorsee, Sean Parnell, would likely have stood the best bet even with his scandal, but he had to step away for family reasons. David McCormick, Dr. Oz's biggest primary competitor, had pretty much all of the same issues in his past that Oz had regarding being socially liberal as well as carpetbagging, not to mention his Joe O'Dea-like comments in 2021 where he supported Trump's impeachment. That would likely have hurt him more and kept the base home just as much and could have been exploited against him when necessary. His only saving grace would have been his funding ability and his ability to grift Western Pennsylvania in a primary with his radio ads, but that's likely not enough, especially if Mastriano truly weighed down Oz a bit as many people speculated, and Barnett likely would have had Mastriano-like funding issues if she became the nominee. I don't think Trump is here to blame at all. There were really no viable candidates, and it's clear that Oz lost partially because Trump's base did not really turn out for him due to many of his past liberal stances, but the majority of the blame here goes on the Pennsylvania Republican Party for not finding a candidate to save their lives who would have beaten Fetterman. Verdict: not Trump's fault. In the state of New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan defeated Brigadier General Don Bolduc decisively. Trump did not get involved in this primary either way, and Bolduc also decided to think it was a genius idea to talk about cutting Social Security. Trump didn't even endorse Bolduc until the 11th hour of the general election. Bolduc also pivoted very hard, and he was not really a good fit for the state of New Hampshire given his hawkish tendencies. He lost by 9 points despite polls indicating a razor-thin race. I also don't think his lazy opponent Chuck Morse would have performed a whole lot better, even if he would have lost by less. Verdict: not Trump's fault. The last Senate seat worth analyzing is the state of Georgia, where Herschel Walker lost to Raphael Warnock by 3 points in the December runoff election. Walker was initially a popular folk hero among the Georgia Republican electorate due to his time as a college football star. He wasn't necessarily Trumpian in policy nature, he just spouted mainly generic conservative talking points. However, he had a lot of skeletons in his closet, many that Trump didn't really know about when he initially asked him to run. He also came off as Fetterman levels of wackiness sometimes.
I don't know if you know vampires are cool people or not, but I'm gonna tell you something that I found out. A werewolf can kill a vampire. Did you know that? I never knew that, so I didn't want to be a vampire anymore. I want to be a werewolf.
And was outspent 3-1, possibly due to his lack of connections given his outsider status. Still, he somehow survived a month later than everybody else. I get that Trump wanted to clean house in the Georgia GOP and replace a lot of these rhinos with loyalists, but I'm not sure endorsing Walker was the best move in retrospect. I believe somebody such as Doug Collins, Calvin King, or Gary Black would have been identical, if not even better, than Herschel Walker on the issues, but would have also been much more electable and performed in line with Kemp in the state. Being objective here, Trump does take the L. Verdict: Trump's fault. And even then, it's not like the Republican establishment bears zero blame in Georgia either. Statewide officials like Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan purposely went out of his way to say he could not vote for Herschel Walker with some bizarre publicity stunt just to win brownie points over at CNN. Ridiculous. not to mention the fact that many other members of the GOP establishment backed Walker in the primary, such as Mitch McConnell, John Thune, and Lindsey Graham. So Trump can arguably be blamed for 1 out of the 5 key Senate races Republicans lost, 20% of the blame. But given how many pundits and amateur analysts are framing the midterms, they would have you think that he's responsible for literally everything. Let's move on to the governor's races. We'll start talking about the underperformance that has kind of been highlighted the most, the state of Pennsylvania. After winning the Pennsylvania gubernatorial primary by an astounding 23-point margin, State Senator Doug Mastriano was shellacked by Democrat Attorney General Josh Shapiro in the general election by a whopping 14.8 percentage points. Mastriano did not know how to properly fundraise and run a general election campaign down the stretch. Initially, even many of the electabros and neocons praised his campaign shortly after he won the primary. However, it did not take long for his lack of initial financial support to allow Shapiro to outraise him and define him, and he was not able to respond because of his lack of resources. Trump endorsed him in the primary, but only after he had taken a commanding primary lead. I initially supported Barletta, but it's very clear that he's not the best campaigner either. He would have also been painted as far right or whatever, just like he was in 2018, and would have lost to Shapiro, even if by a more respectable margin. Trump likely did not endorse Barletta after he saw his 2018 loss, which again, if he did endorse Barletta, it may have changed this race, but even that is not a guarantee. Verdict. Maybe some blame can be attributed to Trump here, but it's not entirely Trump's fault. Democrats flipped Massachusetts, where Charlie Baker was probably going to retire regardless if Trump was attacking him or not. He could easily have won an open primary in the state against a Trump-backed challenger, so I don't even think this needs to be on the list here, but people are blaming Trump for it anyways, so I thought I would still cover it. Verdict, not Trump's fault. Democrats also flipped Maryland. Wes Moore, their current governor now, is very far left, but he won by a ridiculous amount. It's probably the case that the Hoganite choice would have made it closer than Dan Cox did, but it also would have depleted more Republican resources as well, and it's not like it would have been within 10 points regardless. Verdict, not Trump's fault. Up in my birth state of Michigan, Republican nominee Tudor Dixon was on her way to an easy primary victory ever since the state court disqualified several of the Republican frontrunners, even before Trump endorsed in this race. Besides, her opponents were all unviable, some of them were even arrested, even if it was for bogus or politically motivated reasons. Her hardline abortion comments may have been unhelpful among independents, but she still pivoted on the issue, and it's not like even without them she would have done much better. She lost to Whitmer by 10 points, more than what Bill Schuette lost to her by in the blue year wave of 2018. Even given Dixon's flaws, she may still have been the most electable candidate out of that bunch. That doesn't mean that she, or the Michigan Republican Party, gets entirely off the hook for their disastrous performance. But still, verdict, not Trump's fault. Across the lake is the state of Wisconsin. Tim Michels was an awful candidate and a previous loser for statewide office. He even underperformed Bush by 10 points in the state back in 2004 on the same ticket. I know that I endorsed Michels, liking his outsider status and thinking that he would be carried, but I admit that I was wrong. And no, it's not that Michels is too Trumpian or far right for Wisconsin. He's just too generic, unlikable, and a horrendous campaigner. Trump should definitely not have endorsed him, even if I am uncertain about Kleefish's electability being a tad overrated by these electabro types. Verdict, Trump's fault. Let's go south to the state of Illinois, where the GOP was likely not winning this race regardless. Illinois is too blue. And Sullivan and Irvin were no Zeldin, even if both of them would have performed a few points better than Bailey, which I'm not even sure that they would have. Also, Bailey lost by 12, and ran a decent campaign for being as right-wing as controversial as he was. If anything, this was a dagger in the establishment narrative, not proof that losing this race was Trump's fault. Verdict, not Trump's fault. Up in the state of Minnesota, Republicans continued their statewide losing streak. This was decided by the state GOP, and they picked a never-Trumper who had horrendous appeal to the base and also did not really perform that well in the suburbs. Their pick literally may also cost the Republicans a congressional seat in the process. Verdict, not Trump's fault. Many people speculated that Republicans would have had their easiest flip in the state of Kansas. Laura Kelly grifted her way to a narrow victory regardless. Trump endorsed Derek Schmidt in the primary, which he won 80-20, so it's not like Trump really played a role there at all. Also, Schmidt clearly took his win for granted given the lack of polling and lost to the fake moderate incumbent, even while the unpopular Chris Kobach won the Attorney General's race. Verdict: not Trump's fault. Let's go over to Colorado. Jared Polis basically had the DeSantis effect going for him, but as a Democrat, leading a former state that is swinging a certain direction and maintaining an unusually high approval rating while doing so. I don't even believe that Trump even endorsed here in the primary, so this really can't be put on him. Verdict: not Trump's fault. Let's go south to New Mexico, where Republicans shockingly underperformed even compared to expectations of a tight race. Trump did not intervene in the primary. Ronchetti was not exactly Trumpian, yet he performed worse for a statewide office than he did running for Senate, when Trump was on the ballot and lost the state by 11 in 2020. He got a soft general endorsement from Trump that he did not even acknowledge. This was all due to mechanics, not Trump. Verdict: not Trump's fault. And finally, let's go one state west to the state of Arizona. This is a big one, and there's a lot to say here, which is why I'm saving it for last. It's very clear that the number one reason for Kari Lake's loss at this point was mechanics, in one way or another. Plenty of her supporters heard the news on Election Day and felt disillusioned about the process, not to mention anything else that will not be mentioned in this video. This could have been more than enough to make up the 17,000 votes that she lost by, but let's dive into this a bit further because so many people have the wrong takeaway from this. Many will say Lake lost because she attacked McCain voters, but the clip of her insulting McCain Republicans did not truly go viral until after the election took place. Lake also rarely mentioned the 2020 election after the primary as well, and campaigned with Electabro favorite for 2024 Ron DeSantis down the stretch as much as she campaigned with Donald Trump. Should Lake have maybe pivoted earlier? Yeah, maybe, but she needed the grassroots support so long as her opponent, who was being propped up by the establishment, was spending millions of dollars against her trying to portray her as a fake conservative or even a liberal. I do think that her campaign in the general election could have been more well run, and the whole Katie Hobbs's "La Real Racist" tagline was overused, a waste of time, and didn't really sway any voters. Not to mention the fact that the primary being late and competitive was a massive issue. The party establishment should have rallied behind Lake at the beginning of the year when it was apparent she would be very difficult to beat, but they did not. Resources and funding that could have been used to ensure Lake's November victory were exhausted during the primary cycle to make Lake look unpalatable to the general electorate. They couldn't beat her with their millions of dollars they spent against her, so they just chose not to help her down the stretch either. Besides, had Karen Taylor Robson won the primary, there's no guarantee she would have won the general. She was far from rhetorically talented, which would have allowed Hobbs to be willing to step in the debate ring with her and probably gain support in the process. She's very robotic and a gold digger, just like Kelly Loeffler, another establishmentarian loser. She also had severe base issues that would have been hard to overcome given the divisive nature of the primary, as Lake did as well. Not to mention, she scammed elderly people, a talking point which would have doomed her in a state with plenty of retirees. Robeson also did nothing to help Lake down the stretch in the general, and only showed her face again to gleefully support in-state tuition for illegal aliens. I do actually think that if Kimberly Yee was the nominee, she would have won, but not nearly by the 11 points she won her obscure statewide office by as an incumbent against a no-name opponent with zero funding. They will say Lake was a low-quality candidate when in reality she is arguably one of the most rhetorically talented politicians of all time, and she deserved much, much better than this. Verdict: not Trump's fault. So there it is. Of these 9 high-profile governorships, only the blame for maybe 2 of them can be placed on Trump. That's 22.2% at most. Not really enough to pin the blame for the GOP's underperformance on one man. So what about the House? There's too many individual races to cover here, but I still wanted to mention a few key takeaways regardless. I find it funny that people would rather blame Trump's endorsements against candidates who voted to impeach him, rather than to blame representatives for impeaching him over a blatant lie for certain candidates losing. This is in reference to Washington's 3rd and Michigan's 3rd congressional districts, where Joe Kent and John Gibbs respectively both narrowly prevailed in the August 2nd primary. However, they lost the general. Still, John Gibbs performed in line with generic Republican Paul Young in Michigan's 8th, which is a much redder district, and Peter Meyer would likely have lost the district anyways. He barely outperformed Trump in the district in 2020, and he underperformed John James by 2 percentage points. Though, I probably would have rather had John Gibbs run for Fred Upton's seat instead, where he probably would have won, and he would be one of our best congressmen. People will blame Trump for J.R. Majewski's massive underperformance in Ohio's 9th congressional district, but keep in mind that Trump said verbatim that he did not endorse Majewski in the primary because he believed he could not win. He did endorse Madison Jessiotto Gilbert, though, who was a relatively socially liberal Republican who lost the general election by 6 points in an Ohio swing district. He can take the L there, I guess. People will also note that certain Trump-aligned candidates like Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene underperformed. Boebert did, but she did better than Nope and Never Trump or Joe O'Dea in that district, who actually lost the district. Maybe running people who keep the base home at the top of the ticket is not the best idea, but I digress. Marjorie Taylor Greene underperformed too, but Democrats dumped millions of dollars into that district to do just 5 points better than they did in 2020, when a candidate who dropped out was on the ballot. Keep in mind that Trumpian candidates in Georgia, such as Mike Collins and Rich McCormick, who Trump snubbed in the primaries, overperformed by a lot, even more so than Brian Kemp did in the case of Rich McCormick. It's also very true that plenty of generic Republicans underperform nationwide in the House. Looking at races in New Mexico, the Midwest, Pennsylvania, and Texas confirms this. Some of this has to do with down-ballot effects, but we've already established that a lot of that was not necessarily Trump's fault. So what was to blame? Well, first of all, too many competitive primaries are never a good thing. Democrats were pretty much unified behind one candidate from the get-go in a lot of these races, many which were incumbents who used their office and connections to their advantage. We need to eliminate competitive primaries in the future and possibly think about utilizing Virginia or North Dakota-style conventions where necessary. Funding is also an issue. The divisive primaries allowed the establishment to waste tens of millions of dollars slandering America First candidates, and if they won their primaries with their backs stacked against the wall, there was no money left for them in the general election. If there was, it was dumped into safe red states, or it went up to Alaska to save Rhino Lisa Murkowski from losing her general election to an actual Republican. The way we view fundraising needs to change, and if we had competent GOP leadership, November 8, 2022 would have gone a lot differently. Lastly, Republicans need to change the way they view the election system. We need to take advantage of ballot harvesting where legal and find ways to get as many early and mail-in ballots into the ballot box by Election Day the way Democrats do. Yes, our election system ideally needs to change, but while it exists, we're not going to win an election if we don't use it to our advantage. Also, polling was downright awful, and it's also important to note that it's possible that if Republicans did their job with turnout, that maybe the polls would have been accurate, which means that Republicans would have done much, much better than they did on election night. It's also important to note that Trump did not get involved down the stretch very much at all, doing a few rallies here and there, but not nearly as much as he did in 2016, 2018, or 2020. It is true that he maybe can be blamed for not giving enough of his war chest to certain candidates, but Ron DeSantis is sitting on a similar political fortune and didn't give his money up either. I don't see people blaming him for that. He could have not spent a dime and won by 10 instead of 20 and saved the Senate, and maybe some House seats too. And it probably would have bolstered his case for 2024. It's also funny to note that most of these electabros or neo-never-Trumpers, and I had pretty much the same exact prediction for all of these races and general elections. In many cases, they were even more bullish. Yet these are the same people that claim to dunk on me and others for being wrong in our analysis. Let's face it, this election shattered all past norms and metrics. Nobody in their right mind would have forecasted an R+3 national environment where the GOP barely retakes the House and loses a Senate seat. This all but confirms that the GOP approach to the electoral system needs to change. We can look to Republican overperformances in states like California and Florida and New York, where they use the system to their advantage, and compare them to states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, where they have no apparatus and don't. It's really that simple. It's easy to blame candidate quality, but when you have John effing Fetterman as a senator of a swing state and Katie effing Hobbs as the governor of one, while George Santos wins easily in a heavily Biden district, it's time to go back to the drawing board and rework the strategy of navigating election month to our advantage. We still need to make sure that we can get the best candidate elected that is capable of victory in every single race across the country. We also need potential America First candidates for higher profile offices seeking lower offices first. In order to learn the game of politics and build up name recognition, having more connections also helps us solve the funding problem as well. Once we learn the game, we can win. If we just point fingers and blame those without thinking, we'll never save this country. It's really that simple. And that's my take. Make sure to like this video down below, comment your thoughts down below, and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications so you never miss another video. Follow me on social media, the links are all in the description down below. As always, guys, thanks for watching. Red Eagle, out.